Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to today's session. My name is Sharmishta, and I'm from the Azim Premji University. Currently, I'm speaking from Bangalore. A big thank you to all of you for joining us today. We will shortly start, but before that, some quick instructions. Please be on mute while our speakers are speaking. And we will also have the Q&A session wherein you can ask your questions, and we will try our best to take them all in the session today. You may either post your question in the chat box here in Zoom, or you can raise your hand and we will try to take them one by one. For my viewers who are watching the session on YouTube, you may also post in your questions in the YouTube chat box. We will try to take them here. With this, I would like to invite Bhuvana and Madhusudan to take this ahead. Both Bhuvana and Madhusudan are our faculty at Azim Premji University, and they are going to moderate today's session. Over to you, Bhuvana and Madhu.
Thank you, Sharmishta. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion on enacting the NEP 2020, Becoming Inclusive Educators. I'm Bhuvaneshwari. I facilitate some courses related to disabilities and inclusion at Azim Premji University. I'm also involved in the efforts to include students with disabilities in our university and the school within our campus. My colleague Madhusudan is also here, and he will take you through the introductions round. Over to you, Madhu.
Thank you, Bhuvana. Hello, everyone. My name is Madhusudan. I teach inclusive education both in the MA education program as well as the diplomas offered at the university. In my previous work, I was involved in designing teacher development programs, conducted research on disability and inclusive education. I also have a master's in inclusive education from the University of Edinburgh. I'm very delighted to host this webinar today. We have along with my colleague Bhuvana, we have a diverse panel. Each person has a niche and is connected to this theme in various ways. First off, we have Seema Nath, who has a PhD in social and developmental psychology from Cambridge University. She currently works at Umeed Developmental Center, which is a center for children with developmental disabilities. Bhuvana, would you like to introduce our other panelists?
Sure, Madhu, thanks. Our next panelist is Aruna Shankar Narayanan. Author and psychologist Aruna has been teaching at our diploma program in learning disabilities since February 2022. 2022. She's the author of Zero Limits, Things Every 20-something Should Know. She was a founder and director of Prayatna, a center for children with learning difficulties in Bangalore and Chennai for about 22 years. Currently, she writes for the Hindu, Deccan Herald, and Teacher Plus on teaching, learning, work, relationships, and well-being. She authors a monthly column, Youth, that addresses issues of young adults. So welcome to this panel, Aruna. We're very happy to have you here.
Thank you, Bhuvana. Thank you. Delighted to be here. Yeah.
Thank you. We also have Kushal Dattani with us. He is a co-founder and team lead at Samaid Shala, based out of Ahmedabad. Kushal is passionate about bringing inclusion alive for mainstream schooling in India. After 5 years of his work in special education in Melbourne, Kushal took up the Teach for India Fellowship in 2014. Since then, he's been trying to decode what inclusion means in India in the absence of appropriate policies. He is currently working on building instructional capacity in schools by supporting teachers as well as the school management. Someone once told me one thing, that something that really makes Kushal very uncomfortable is seeing a child being very disengaged in the classroom. So such is his passion towards inclusion. Very happy to have you here, Kushal, on the panel. Welcome.
Thank you, Bhavna. Thank you for the kind words.
So, Madhu, our audience today will find it very useful if you can please set the context for today's discussion. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the NEP 2020 seems to recognize various forms of marginalization and exclusion with the use of an acronym SEBG, socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, which recognizes various discriminations based on gender, caste, disability, geography, religion, culture, and income. It goes on to provide details of schemes and initiatives such as Gender Inclusion Fund for state governments to avail various resources for children who are girls and transgender children. When it comes to disability, it adopts the Right to Persons with Disability 2016. It does so by saying that one should have tailored content or use of assistive technology. Therefore, my first question is to you, Seema. Do you feel the NEP is far-reaching when it comes to the idea of inclusive education with respect to international discourse?
Thanks, Madhu, for that question. So yes, I do think it does, because India's policy discourse has kept tandem with the international discourse on inclusive education since the beginning of the Right to Education Act, even before that to an extent, but from the Right to Education Act, when it adopted a very human rights and social justice focused lens, since for defining inclusive education, it has really set the tone. And within the Indian policy discourse, inclusive education has been understood as one where all students are equal participants in the learning process. What this has meant is that the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, which was entrusted with implementing RTE, has also talked about this. And what the national education policy does is now taking this discussion further. The NEP takes a more intersectional approach to inclusion, and it also takes into account the various socioeconomically disadvantaged groups in terms of gender identities, which may include female and transgender individuals, socio-cultural identities, geographical identities, socioeconomic identities, disabilities, and all other forms of marginalization, which does kind of sets the tone for us to start thinking about inclusion in a very, very broad, holistic, and a very in-depth manner. And that is what it does, the NEP, is takes the discussion forward. It brings in the new understanding that is evolving, because inclusion is a journey. There is no end goal to inclusion, to how inclusive we can be. And this is something that is being brought about. And what NEP tries to do, since everything that has happened in the past, is actually taking this conversation forward. And it does take into account a lot of what is being talked about within the international inclusive education discourse globally, which also talks about barrier-free access, talks about inclusion from a very, very intersectional approach. Along with that, its focus, it envisions, like the NEP envisions inclusive education, not just for students, but also for teacher education, and calls for structural reforms. And that actually is what, again, is very, very reminiscent of what is happening within the international discourse as well, that we can't just talk about these things, we need to do something about these. And its focus on teacher education, on students, inclusion of all students in the learning journey, and this emphasis on equitable and inclusive education reverberates this idea that no child should be left behind, which is such a big part of the international discourse as well, no child left behind. And especially another important thing is that understanding that an inclusive education is what can be a tool for achieving social mobility, economic mobility, inclusion, equity, and using education as a tool for and of inclusion. So this this fundamental reforms that it talks about within the education system also puts teacher at a very, very center, at the heart of it all. So keeping all of this in mind, it definitely does echo a lot of the things that are being talked about in the international discourse. And even in terms of, for example, in gender inclusion, it talks about sanitation, toilets, conditional cash transfers, sorry. It talks about disability inclusive education. It talks about a lot of provisions. And what was missing in most of our policy discourse has been implementation. And the NEP even talks about implementation guidelines. And so in many ways, it does echo a lot of the critiques of inclusive education. Like, it has been an idea which has not actually been executed in a very, very systematic manner. And that is something that it tries to address in a very, very systematic manner. Of course, it comes with its own challenges. It comes with its own learning journey and learning curve. But at the same time, it is really, really exciting. And that's why I definitely feel that the NEP is far-reaching, as you asked, in its discourse. And also, in my opinion, it's a great start to continue building on it and using it to make access and meaningful participation in the education system a reality for all. The emphasis being on meaningful participation and access. So I'm really excited to see how this implementation takes place, how the next 10 to 20 years look like for our education system, and whether we are able to learn from everything that has happened so far, and from what is happening in the entire world globally on the inclusion aspects. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Seema, for breaking that down and giving us a clear picture of what's happening in India right now, and how the policies, how do we expect them to get translated into practice. You also mentioned that this puts the teacher at the center, right? So I have a question for Aruna here. So Aruna, the NEP seems to indicate that indicate the need for all teachers to be more inclusive, right? So how can teachers start becoming more inclusive? Where do they actually begin? You're on mute, Aruna. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
My screen had frozen. I apologize for that. Okay. So like Seema just said, inclusion is a journey with the teacher playing a very pivotal role in the entire process. So to be truly inclusive in the broader sense of the term involves vision, a deep commitment, resources, and constant vigilance, as it's a continual process. And as Seema just pointed out, children differ on multiple dimensions. So being inclusive in spirit and deed then involves respecting the whatever physical, cognitive, social, emotional, cultural, linguistic, economic, gender, or spiritual differences that children bring, and believing that every child, no matter what their learning profile or background, can make a valued contribution to society. So this is a tall order for any teacher. And while a school may promote inclusion as a philosophy, all the stakeholders have to champion the cause and work together as a team. Of course, the classroom teacher plays a very focal role and has to go the extra mile to make classrooms inclusive. So what can teachers do? Foremost is to create a climate in the classroom that's warm and welcoming to all students, irrespective of whatever differences they bring to the learning situation. Second, teachers must believe that every child, regardless of their profile and background, is capable of learning, growing, and developing, although in different ways. Third, to meet these differences, the differences in learning needs that children will present, requires a lot of planning and support for the teachers. So teachers need to have a very structured approach with flexibility built into it. So, for example, one of the ways they could possibly do this is by differentiated instruction, where teachers meet the varying learning needs of children through a process of differentiation. And differentiation can happen in three ways. In terms of the content or what is taught, the process or how it is taught, and the product or what is expected of the child in terms of their learning. And giving children a choice in either one or all of these three parameters can promote autonomy, which is known to build intrinsic motivation, which enhances learning. So teachers also may have to wear multiple hats. So earlier, we had a teacher who was primarily responsible for delivering the curriculum, and children with special needs received, if they were from fortunate backgrounds, auxiliary services, either sometimes within the school, but more likely outside the school. And these involved maybe speech therapists, occupational therapists, special educators, psychologists, etc. So a gamut of professionals were providing the auxiliary services. But as a school moves more and more towards inclusion, many of these services may be provided in the school and, when feasible, within the classroom itself, and if possible, may be woven into the lesson. So how do you go about doing this? One possible way is co-teaching, where the teacher teams up with another professional and together they deliver content while also providing auxiliary services that the different children may require. And co-teaching has been found to promote student achievement and enhance teacher well-being, which is again very closely tied to student achievement, because it removes the onus of an individual teacher when you have a teamwork approach. But then again, I understand that co-teaching is not an option in many schools because of resource constraints. So in those kind of situations, the teacher may depend on things like peer-mediated intervention or even self-mediated intervention, where the teachers equip children with special needs with certain strategies so that they can cope better in mainstream classrooms. So these are some suggestions just to get started with this in this journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Aruna. That was quite a bit, the suggestions that you were giving. So I wanted to understand from Kushal, because he's been working in a variety of school spaces. Kushal, could you talk about the challenges you face while trying to make such spaces more inclusive? For example, if you're trying to modify the teaching learning materials to suit the needs of all children, especially those with disabilities, or any other challenges that you have faced?
So three particular things that I can definitely think of from the purpose of modifying certain practices in school. One is structure. The structures inside the school are still in quite a school, even we call like some elite schools, like we still have those old primitive infrastructures like hard benches, which are really difficult to move. Then we want to have 21st century practices inside the school to be taught to children, right? We talk about creativity, collaborations and practices, but by design, these classrooms are so inaccessible to make those things possible. Peer learning, if you even say peer learning or collaborations, those hard benches and structures really make it difficult for teachers to even imagine, okay, how do I foster collaboration and peer learning inside my classroom? Although there are different ways in which schools do innovate doing this and going about it. Second thing, even when schools want to do these things in spite of those obstacles and infrastructure challenges, the hindrance comes at the level of intent, right? And I would strongly put intent at all the three levels of school management, intent for teachers and intent from parents. Like from the school management, like how much is the school management aware about like special education practices and which children really need to go to special educators and which children can be catered in the school and classrooms, right? Special institutions actually came up 60 years back as resource centers largely to support mainstream schooling system. But over the years, it largely took the mainstream took it as a parallel system to cater to children with disabilities, and that became a lot more difficult for children to be catered inside the schooling system and imagine inclusion as a wholesome way. Intent from teachers, like with what intent does a teacher every single day as a teacher do I enter into the classroom? And there's one question that we hold in all our spaces with teachers is, are we here to teach the content or are we here to teach the child, right? And that just dismantles the whole aspect of practices that we have in our mind. We think that having strategies will help. We think that having support will help. And we have seen all of those things really failing within the absence of an intent, right? If I'm completely determined or if I'm completely guided only to support the curriculum and syllabus, then I have literally no time to understand the child for a successful inclusion of the child. And the third thing from parent largely is, what is the intent of parent for selecting a school? Is it infrastructure? Is it facilities, labels, names, or academic records? Or is it really the caring attitude of teachers, the culture and environment inside the school, schools' teacher training plans, schools' efforts of parents' awareness? These three intent across these three stakeholders are so mismatched that having a dialogue with one becomes so difficult, because then all their interest and their intent is really scattered. So apart from structure and intent, the third thing is awareness. I think in the last decade or so, my understanding of the availability of resources is just so much. I don't know whether those many resources are being like spread out with so much awareness at the ground level. There are excellent available resources from the government and different philanthropic institutions today. For example, NCERT has documentations for teachers, right? Teacher handbooks for particularly children with special needs at primary and middle school level, which has a lot of recommendations, practices across. CBSE has teacher practitioner handbooks. Disability organizations have on their website multiple level of resources which are available for schooling systems to take it through and implement in the school. But I think that level of awareness is still a challenge when we try to make it. And because that awareness is not there, when we try to bring it, there's a lot of resistance and thrust that we see in the school. Yeah.
Thanks, Kushal. I think all three of you, I think there's a common thread in what all of you have spoken. And I think that's the fact that there's a need for structural changes at various levels, at school level and perhaps at various levels of government infrastructure as well, which points to, which is a good cue for this next question, which is Seema, have you come across any research which implements inclusion and inclusive aspects of NEP? Is there something that you would like to share about that?
Let me think. So the NEP came into force in 2020. Of course, the draft versions have been around for a few years. And then the implementation guidelines have come up in 21 in the form of the Sarthak manuals. However, I'm not aware if there is currently like any research going on, but a lot of what I see in these documents are things that come from a lot of research that has already taken place within this area. A lot of what Kushal, you were talking about in terms of awareness, a lot of the research on inclusive education has had to do with understanding of attitudes of teachers, stakeholders on their attitudes towards inclusive education, because unless there is an attitude to be inclusive, to actually understand that diversity exists in the classroom, and a lot of what this research has shown is a lack of teacher preparedness. As you said, resources exist, but at the same time, teachers don't feel prepared to support students with diverse needs in the classroom. They don't feel equipped to understand and respond to the student diversity. So a lot of the research within the Indian context now, in the last few years that I have been engaged with, has also shown that there are various ways. There are ways of engaging with and responding to the needs of diverse students within the classroom. And that is where the understanding also needs to come that we need to respond to the diversity, because the diversity is non-negotiable. It is there. We are all different. It comes down to supporting teachers. It comes down to thinking of ways in which teacher professional development takes place, in which the stakeholders in the school, be it the head teachers, be it policymakers, be it even the community members, the parents, the larger community within which the school is located, how do they also support the school in responding to the needs of the students? And all of it does require a lot of thought, and research has looked at various aspects of it. And I see a lot of it being talked about, and a lot of the research on NEP and its implementation within the inclusive education that I have read recently is more looking at it very, very critically to see how does it respond? What is it that the NEP is doing differently than it was doing earlier? What are some of the ways in which we can start thinking about some of the critiques that has already been existing? For example, there has been so many, like just the reporting structure. There are so many different departments. Do we go to the Ministry of Social Justice? Do we go to the Department of Education? And all of that to a large extent has been addressed. Like, so it means somebody's reading this research that is coming out and actually addressing in the NEP, because they have taken into some of those things into account and are streamlining a lot of these processes. There has been a lot of information pertaining to not just how to do physical infrastructure changes, but also when we talk about quality education, what does it mean? What does it entail? What are some of the things that we need to do? So, and this research is happening. I mean, there are glimpses of this research being adopted, in fact, into the national education policy, but it's yet to see how, like, as the implementation process moves forward, it'll be really, really interesting to see now how does it get implemented in action, and how do we evaluate how this implementation is taking place? How do we learn from what is happening and be able to actually make changes if necessary as we move forward? So that's what I have come across so far. And
Thank you. Yeah, it is early days for sure. And I think one of the things that the NEP does sort of recognize is the fact that there needs to be a rehaul or innovation in the area of assessment specifically in order to promote greater inclusion. And that's something I think both Kushal and Aruna have also spoken of. So I want to throw a hypothetical to the whole group here. If we were to consider, let's say, a reading difficulty like dyslexia as an example, what kind of reforms would you like to see in the classroom and in schools? Aruna, do you want to take a stab at that first? Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Anyone?
So if you're talking specifically about dyslexia, I think one thing that we need to do is we put a lot of emphasis on literacy skills early on. In many Indian schools, reading and writing is emphasized, but we don't look at oral language development. And oral language skills are an essential, integral part of literacy. And I think we need to ensure that children speak and understand a language before we start pushing reading and writing. So one is to look at that aspect, because all our assessments, all the teaching is geared towards reading and writing, and the listening and speaking are almost entirely ignored. So changing that emphasis would again help, because children have to be able to understand the language. Next, we need to follow a systematic approach for reading. Whether it's instruction in English or an Indian language, the teaching has to follow a systematic process. Third, reading aloud to children is also very conducive to picking up both oral language skills and reading, and picking books from a variety of genres relating to themes that possibly excite and arouse curiosity in children is excellent. If you can pick themes that overlap with children's interests, that's again a great way of helping children who are very resistant to read to overcome their diffidence. Right from the beginning, we need to emphasize that reading needs to be paired with meaning. We don't want to produce children who are word callers, who are able to say words aloud, but not associate meaning with it. So even the way we go about teaching reading, the way we assess reading, the kind of processes that we want children to develop, we need to keep emphasizing that they need to decipher or extract meaning from print. Because they need to see that reading is associated with meaning. Otherwise, it is a mindless activity. Then teachers across various subject areas, not just the English or the language teachers, need to model active reading for students. Now, active reading is when good readers, when they are reading, have a host of various processes that are happening inside their heads. It's almost like you're having a conversation with the author. You question what you are reading. You make connections with yourself, with the world, with something that you read earlier. You try to synthesize what you've read. You paraphrase. You try to visualize what you are reading. So all these cognitive processes are happening inside the reader's head. If teachers can make that more explicit and visible to students of how they read when they are going through a text, I think that can go a long way in helping children not just overcome their reading difficulties, but even for other children to just make sense of the content. How can you engage deeply with content to make it your own? So that's something that all teachers can do. Then for kids with reading disabilities, of course, having activities and worksheets at multiple levels. Then having buddy systems where you pair a good reader with a weaker reader, and they read aloud to each other. And with time, the hopefully the weaker reader will pick up reading skills. And so basically promoting a cooperative culture in classrooms where children are encouraged to help each other rather than just compete with one another. And when possible, to incorporate multiple modalities into your teaching. So this could be using charts, videos, manipulatives, models, etc., so that you appeal to a diverse variety of learners. If a subset of children is still falling behind, then the teacher may work with them individually or in small groups when the other children are possibly doing some other assigned work, to help them build certain skills they may be lagging in. And if this doesn't work or is not enough, then you probably need to enlist further help for the child. But these are some of the things that, not just reading instructors, but all teachers, because reading is involved in all subject areas, can try to implement in the classroom.
Right. Thanks, Aruna, for all these suggestions. And for those whose hands are raised on Zoom, we will take your questions shortly. Just give us a few more minutes for this discussion. Thank you. So, Aruna, after all that you have said, the focus again comes back to the teacher and how equipped the teachers need to be and what can they do in the classroom to make it equitable for all the children. So as we look at the NEP, we understand that it recognizes the importance of teacher education within the context of inclusive education. But it really doesn't expand a lot about it. So what, according to you, could be some key opportunities for teacher development? Any of you can take the question. Kushal, would you like to go first?
Yes. So a lot of my experience or my interaction has been in the in-service space with the teachers. So I can highlight certain practices or certain things that opportunities that does exist in the in-service teacher space. I've always seen teacher training or teacher capacity building is all as a part of the larger segment of teacher professional development. And I think NEP has not elaborated enough or not done justice at all to the in-service teacher education space dialogue as well. There's just one small paragraph of 6 lines for the whole in-service, and it has completely missed recognizing or admitting that there are nearly around 10 million teachers in the in-service space today, right? It has talked a lot about pre-service. But when we talk about the in-service space where teachers are already there in the classroom today, I think seeing teacher development as an ecological support system vis-a-vis capsule-based training including with inclusion of teacher training, teacher compensation and benefits, well-being, teacher recognitions in the school, in the community, teacher promotions. NEP has given a fantastic recommendation of horizontal upskilling and promotion for teachers, largely where we see teachers in the pre-primary segment or primary underpaid, undervalued than high school, middle and high school, which is a completely flawed process in itself, right? It doesn't make pre-primary and primary attractive, whereas children are equally there in every segment. So understanding that, and I will just address one small part of teacher training under the teacher professional development, is most teacher trainings focus on the knowledge and skills. And I think that's going to be super redundant in the next decade or so, where we only focus on knowledge and skills because they are freely available. In the last 1 decade, every kind of knowledge is freely available online and in the last 2-3 years through asynchronous courses on different platforms. What the training programs miss or have ineffectively placed today is the mindset. When the teacher comes back or takes that knowledge and skill in some or the other way, coming back to the classroom and helping or being a support for the teacher in the implementation is where the major game changing needs to happen. And I think if I give an example here very quickly, if you are a teacher with 2 to 3 years of experience, and if you would have undergone certain training, or even if you're a school leader who would have undertaken certain trainings in your school, if you're able to list down 8 to 10 practices that the school has learned new or the teacher has learned new, I don't think you really need the 11th one right away for any reason. You need cross-functionalization or cross-utilization of those 8 to 10 practices rather than learning 10 more, right? Because that's not going to help in any way, learning 10 more practices. And that is where the school leaders have the role to play as a mentor, as a coach, support for observations and feedback for teachers. And those practices need to be understood how they go with different grades and different children. Another aspect in the teacher professional development is technology. I think it's still at a very nascent stage, underutilized as a strength. Leveraging technology for self-capacity building, where you don't have to wait for a trainer to disseminate knowledge, or school doesn't invite a trainer to disseminate knowledge. Rather, the school and the teachers upskill themselves using technology for the knowledge piece, and the skill and the mindset piece, which is largely from supporting how does a school leverage trainers or training organizations largely to help them customize that for their classroom. And because that's where the school also lack a lot more skill sets and they find it challenging. Finally, one thing which I would like to definitely focus on, which has come a lot during the COVID, we have talked about a lot of neurodiversity. We talk about neurodiverse children in the classroom. And I think one thing which we have no clue about is when we talk about neurodiverse, before addressing the diversity, do we understand the neuro very well? Do we understand the brain? How does the brain of every child works? Which links to my previous aspect where I said, am I here to teach the content or am I here to teach the child? If I'm here to teach the child, I cannot ignore the neuro part in neurodiversity. Are my teachers or am I as a teacher equipped to understand the brain as a whole? All the parts of the brain to understand the children in my classroom, whether it is children with disability or neurodiverse or even gifted children. I think these are extremely important 3 things to inculcate in as an opportunity in the school.
Would any of you want to add on to what Kushal was saying, Aruna or Seema?
Yeah, can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think Kushal raised some excellent points, and I would just like to build on it and give more areas where I think the NEP has fallen short. So in today's world, with an increase in mental health issues, especially in children and young people, I think it's imperative that social emotional literacy becomes part and parcel of the school curriculum. So it's very important that teachers receive training in this. And like Kushal rightly said, the in-service teachers as well. And SEL or social-emotional literacy should be accorded the same emphasis that we currently give to the 3 hours of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And this shouldn't just stop in the early grades, but should continue right up to class 12. And so obviously teachers need a lot of training, not only in terms of delivering the curriculum, but also in terms of practicing it and living it. Because unless you practice what you preach in SEL, there is no impact. So for SEL to be successful, the school has to be an emotionally safe space for all children. And this again ties into inclusion very closely. And this applies to both children with and without disabilities. In fact, every member of the school, right from the watchman at the gate, up to the principal, needs to be trained in SEL so that they respond to children's, teachers, and each other's needs with sensitivity. So for teachers, that would be, besides identifying children who are at risk for mental health issues and guiding them towards appropriate professionals, schools may also look at preventive programs. How can we stop these problems from arising in the first place? So programs that build resilience, reduce negativity, these are all things that schools can actually teach. Additionally, they can draw from findings from positive psychological research, and there's been a lot of research in the last 2 decades. So that children are not just functioning in school, but they're actually thriving. So what can schools do for every child to feel that way? And one more point that I would like to add regarding this document and teacher education. It talks about teacher education, but it does not mention the need for attracting talented people to the teaching profession. In our country, we already have a paucity of teachers. So not only do we need qualified personnel, we also need people with passion, compassion, commitment, and a deep love of learning. So unless a teacher embodies these qualities, they will not be able to inspire children. So attracting and retaining talent is a priority, which I think has not been addressed.
Can I add to this conversation? It's really interesting. Actually, thank you, Kushal and Aruna, for adding, because I echo a lot of what you have said. And you'll be happy to know that a lot of what you are saying is actually getting implemented within what is called the Nishtha program, which is the teacher education program, which does talk about supporting on not just teacher development, but also school leadership development. It talks about social-emotional learning and supporting. It talks about building perspectives for inclusive education. It talks about using a lot of providing support in terms of social-emotional learning, in terms of mental health support to not just teachers, not just counselors, but even to classroom educators. And talks about integration of ICT in teaching learning materials, in a lot of teachers being supported to adopt assessment techniques which are stress-free, quote unquote. And I think that is where the whole interesting aspects of it is, when I say that a lot of what we are saying, a lot of what we are discussing in these forums, what is coming out from research is somehow getting addressed on paper. It would be really, really interesting, of course, to see how it gets. We are a country of more than 1 billion people. Our school going children, like, it's a huge amount. So to actually see how this teacher professional development takes place, how do we talk about not just inclusion as just a standalone thing, but talk about education. And in that, actually, from my reading of NEP, is that a lot of these inclusive aspects are getting imbibed within and being talked about. But at the same time, what is happening is what Kushal, you mentioned, is that there is all this knowledge, there is all this information, but who's accessing? Like, who knows that this is also happening? Who knows how is it happening? Like, how are we going to implement it? How are we going to think about it? And that itself is, I think, what you mentioned about awareness and comes into focus, because a lot about it is also building awareness about that these tools exist, that there are things in motion, there are support available for teachers, there are thoughts on how the different ways of accessing and responding to the diversity in classrooms is happening, but this information is somewhere lost and it's not coming into the forefront. I totally agree with Aruna. Social-emotional learning is such an integral part supporting mental health, and it is being talked about. But then it is not coming up in the popular discourse that it is. So many states are implementing social-emotional learning across India, but we only know about very, very few states. We don't know about the extent to which it is getting incorporated and how. And there needs to be more information and more awareness about what the NEP is doing and how it is doing. What are all these guidelines that are taking place? Because these are some very important things that the panel is bringing up today about, like, and this is what will lead us to developing and strengthening inclusion in the schools. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think there's, I'd like to ask one last question before we hand it to the audience here. And I know there are many here. I think referring back to the NEP, one thing that is not very clear to me is that it seems to encourage it seems to encourage both for children to go to special schools or home-based education or even regular schools. So my question is, does this somehow bring ambiguity somehow?
Should I?
Yeah, Seema.
It brings ambiguity, but in a different sort of way, I would say, because in my reading of the NEP, it talks about that inclusion needs to be there, even if it is a special education, if it is neighborhood schools, if it's home-based education, we can't negate the need for equity and inclusion in each of these. And that, in fact, the NEP has very clearly said that home-based education should not be seen as lesser than a classroom education, for example. But at the same time, there are various challenges that stay about this, how it is executed, how does home-based education take place, the governance of special schools, what does that look like, in terms of what is the differentiation between special education? Is there any kind of, like, when do you decide? It does say the decision remains with, like, the family, they can decide, but on what basis? How do you, like, there's still a lot of ambiguity on those fronts in terms of the fact that inclusion has to take place no matter whether it's home-based or a special school or a mainstream school. From my understanding of reading the NEP, they talk about inclusion being, and not one system, they're all at par. One system is not looked at as better than the other, especially home-based education. They have very specifically mentioned that you can't think of it as anything lesser than. But then questions do arise in terms of how all these different forms of education, what the governance structures, as I said, or how it's going to continue, what is it going to look like, and maybe I still need to continue looking at these aspects. I would love to know more and hope to have more clarity on these.
Can I add to that?
Comment? Yeah, Aruna, please.
Yeah, thank you, Seema, for raising that point. I think the ambiguity that we are talking about, I think it comes due to the fact, at what level are we looking at inclusion? Is it at the school level or the societal level? As Seema said, because we have to look at it from the larger context. But even if we take it then you need to have look at home-based education, you need to look at special schools and regular schools, treat all of them on par. But even if we look at it purely from the school level of whether schools are inclusive, as we've been discussing right from the beginning, it's an ongoing process. No school is going to grow inclusive overnight. It's something that evolves. And it's probably more prudent to say that these need to evolve more organically, that schools grow more and more inclusive. And I don't think it's fair to thrust a child with special needs into a school that is not capable or ready to meet the needs of this child. So it's probably more prudent to have mainstream schools that are becoming more inclusive with special schools running in tandem. But as schools become more inclusive, the need for special schools may reduce over time. It may not completely disappear. That may be unrealistic to have that vision. But I think this is how we have to see it, as an organic process that is evolving.
Yeah, I think there's perhaps a related question in, so it is now, thanks to everyone, but it's now open for the audience to post their questions. And I see one question which seems to be related to the discussion just yet, so that it continues smoothly, is that if a setting is already segregated in some way, how do we bring inclusion there? That seems to be one question from the audience, if anybody wants to take that.
I'll try to take a stab at it. I'm not sure if I'll do justice to the question. See, ultimately, inclusion is a state of mind in terms of how accepting you are to difference. So just because a child is attending a special school doesn't have to be viewed differently by society, regardless of which school you go to, what kind of disability you have. It's looking for acceptance and to be treated with dignity, because ultimately that's what we are working towards, becoming an inclusive society, not just having an inclusive school. And then you can't have discrimination outside the school. So what we are looking is to build an inclusive society. I think it's ultimately having the right mindset and also educating children to adopt that mindset.
I would just extend in terms of what Aruna shared. When we say segregation happening, my understanding and what I have witnessed also is like there is some bit of inclusion happening everywhere, and that school or that institution is able to make that inclusion happen because of the available resources first at their end, or available possibilities at their end. And inclusion in the broader sense, as Seema started sharing at the start as well, how SEDG that has been mentioned in the NEP, where we not only look for children with disabilities, but children from marginalized communities, socially, economically disadvantaged communities, transgender communities, wherever possible, whichever community is there inside the school, and we start thinking about that. We understand that there is some bit of inclusion there, and then internally it is an understanding of how much and where we need to move towards step by step. So just to second Aruna's thing, that completely having inclusion just for one segment or things may not be possible right away as well.
Okay, thanks Aruna and Kushal. There are some questions on chat and we had people raising their hands. So I'll try to read out the questions and allow people to ask their question themselves in order. So one of the questions we had earlier was on chat was, when we say inclusion, should we limit ourselves to disability or complete diverse conditions? If it is diverse, how to include the gifted?
Does anyone, Seema, you want to go ahead?
No, Aruna, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. See, again, it depends how you view inclusion. Ultimately, in the broader sense, it is, yes, of course, including all kinds of children, the kids with disabilities and the gifted kids, and the so-called, what is now called the 2E kids, or the twice exceptional kids who have giftedness and disability. So it depends on what the school is able to offer in terms of resources and teacher training. So I know of schools that cater more towards the gifted end of the spectrum, and there are schools that cater more to the LD segment. And there are schools that are able to cater to both. So again, there's no right or wrong answer in this. It's what you are able to deliver so that the children feel that their potential is being realized in the school. So I don't think we can have a hard and fast rule that inclusion is this, but not that. Ultimately, inclusion is about including everyone.
Right. So does anyone want to add on, or can I go to the next question?
I think please proceed. Yeah,
Okay.
we have a
So there are two questions which look related to each other. One is about how do we equip our teachers for them to be able to do all of this? And related to that, there is a question on teachers wearing multiple hats, given the public education system where most government school teachers already have more than one hat in terms of elections, census, etc. Imagining them to, or even obliging them to wear one more hat, and that to a very big, peculiar and heavy hat of being an inclusive practitioner, seems painful. How many differences can these teachers be equipped and expected to understand? How do we go about it? It's such a huge task. Can states play a major role in this?
Can I respond to that?
Yes, please, Seema.
So I think this goes back to what Kushal and Aruna has been talking about, is it's about perspective. Inclusive education is nothing but just good teaching and learning practices. It is what addresses the needs of your classroom. It's what addresses the needs that exist. And for that, it is not something which is different, or it doesn't entail doing something new, but it means being very, very mindful and understanding what are the needs of the students and then addressing. And for that, one of the things that we do need to consider is that teachers need support. For example, Kushal mentioned in the beginning that special educators are there to support mainstream teachers. And over a period of time, it became that their responsibility was to support other, only the children who were the classroom teacher felt they ill-equipped to support. But if we can actually build those support structures where the special educators are there to confer for the mainstream classroom teacher, they're there to support the teacher, understand what kind of teaching and learning practices to adopt in the classroom, what are some of the ways in which they can respond to the different needs of the students. And that is where, when we think about inclusion, I really like what Aruna just said about you can't think about one segment at a time. You have to think about all children, and only then. And that is what a classroom is. And we are adding the word inclusion because the hope is that at some point we don't need to keep emphasizing education by default is inclusive. And education, not just for teachers, students, but even for teachers, because the same diversity that exists amongst the teachers, we have to understand that that diversity exists among teachers as well. So how do we make our teacher education systems respond to the needs of teachers as well, or the diversity of teachers that come into? So all of these are ways of responding. The states, actually, I'm not sure about states, but at the policy and the implementation level, where the NEP and the implementation has been planned, they are talking about embedding a lot of these practices within. which hopefully over a period of time will support. And inclusion is not something that we can do alone. It is a community initiative. We need to create inclusion as a community. We need to work together. The school, if we think about the school as that community, all the students have to be there besides the teacher to help the teacher create an inclusive classroom. The teacher has to have the support of their peer teachers, the support of the head teachers. So thinking of it as a standalone thing, yes, it can sound very, very daunting and very, very big. So we do need to think about inclusion as a community, as a very, very something that we do together and not one at a time or for one person or one stakeholder at a time.
Thank you, Seema. There's one interesting question also on multilingualism. As the NEP has given a lot of emphasis on multilingualism, my question is, has there been any research on how to handle a multilingual classroom situation?
I think there's research on bilingual classrooms. I'm not sure about multilingual classrooms. Does anybody want to? I think that, but there is a lot of a body of work on bilingual classrooms, and that they do work where you can teach in 2 languages. Does anybody want to add?
There is a lot of there is research within the Indian context which also talks about classrooms which have multiple languages spoken. So, or where English is like the second language, right? The medium of instruction is English, but most of the students are coming from various linguistic backgrounds, not just one, but multiple linguistic backgrounds, how to support. And again, even in those, some of the ways in which it has been talked about responding to multiple languages is through co-working between different educators who understand different languages working together. And if they don't, then working with the community people to respond to the needs. So it is, and most of the research, as you rightly pointed out, Aruna, is in bilingual bilingual support in the classroom. There's a lot things like how to use a sandwich technique in the classroom, how to use reading, and how to access different languages for different students. All of it is there. But again, it is still an under-researched area from what I understand when it comes to multilingualism.
Okay, thank you. Vinisha had her hand raised earlier. So Vinisha, would you want to ask your question now?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for such a wonderful discussion. It was really an eye-opener. I have 2 questions. One is that post-COVID, a lot of children are facing gaps in their studies because online classes, although they were there, but many children didn't actually attend those classes to its purpose, and now a lot of learning gaps are observed in children. Like a child from 3rd class has directly come into 5th class, so the skills and the developmental milestones that he should have achieved are not there. So I wanted to ask, how can we bridge this gap because of the pandemic?
I think, can I go ahead, Bhuvna?
Yes, Aruna, please.
I think using some of the strategies that we use for children with learning difficulties can be applied to all children who are facing a lag in their learning. We also need to give them time to catch up. It's going to not happen overnight or in a few weeks. It's possibly going to take a few months and maybe even longer. But I think a lot of those same techniques can be used to help children bridge the gaps, whether it's in their reading literacy or in their numeracy skills. So I did outline some of the things for literacy. So similarly, there are things for mathematics also, which I won't elaborate right now.
Also, I can add, like with the gaps flowing in, my understanding is very clear while talking to so many principals around as well. If we try to address the gap, taking school as the only medium to address the gap, we are going to get exhausted and burnt out very, very soon at school level. So here, during the COVID times, children have gotten hang of, and many children have been very, very comfortable with self-learning as well. I wouldn't say all of them, yes, but across multiple grades, different children have gotten used to and comfortable with self-learning. Understanding which children are comfortable with such self-learning modes and actually assisting them further with such open source digital tools and using technology, leveraging technology to maximum extent there. Also, equipping parents through school-wide PTMs with such platforms, with such practices where parents can take children further as well. So leveraging all the three mediums of children, school, platforms, and parent is extremely critical, so that no one aspect is being exhausted or burnt out.
Yeah, thank you. I think Beena can go next. Beena Shah had her hand raised. Do you want to ask your question, Beena? Okay. There was one question earlier. All this is so aligned with Montessori principles. So will Montessori principles and structure be more nationalized? That's what I understand from the chat.
Should I respond?
Yes, Seema, please.
So, yeah, like a lot of what the Montessori teaching methods talk about, in fact, the basis of what Maria Montessori talked about is inclusive education. In fact, the way she designed it was meant to respond to the needs of students from backgrounds and children with disabilities. So, yes, it does respond. And one of the things that happens is that Montessori is seen as something that is done for only primary level students, but the principles, the basic underlying philosophy of Montessori can move over to the higher grades. And in fact, a lot of what we call activity-based teaching and learning, it has similar etiology with Montessori teaching and learning as well. So I wouldn't go on to say that it should to have an opinion on it, but definitely Montessori teaching and learning is very, very inclusive. The way it has been thought through and conceptualized by Maria Montessori was a very, very inclusive framework.
Okay, thanks, Seema, for that. There's a question regarding utilizing differentiated instruction. How does a teacher decide what is challenging for which child? Do they decide at all? In an assessment paper with DI, won't most children just answer what seems easiest to them or what they liked most as a topic?
Seema, do you want to take this or should I answer?
Please go ahead.
Honestly, I don't think children would necessarily go for answering the easiest questions. They are naturally curious and they are motivated to challenge themselves. So if the teacher gives the autonomy to students to pick the levels that they would like without necessarily labeling them as 1, 2, 3, or in such an obviously hierarchical manner, I think children will, like water seeks its own level, they will gravitate towards the worksheets that speak to them, to the activities. So I don't think we need to be worried about that. It is our adult conceptions of learning and doing the easiest thing and scoring the highest marks. If we remove those fears from learning, all children would gravitate to what would extend their minds.
Thank you, Aruna. There are more questions on chat. Would Goldie want to go ahead and ask her question? And then Sri Lekha, then we'll take more questions from the chat.
Hello. Hi.
Yes,
Am I
Goldie,
audible?
please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Can I use Hindi? Can I speak in Hindi?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, as I am Gandhi Fellow, so currently I'm a Gandhi Fellow and working in Chamba district, state Himachal Pradesh. So basically, I have started doing work on inclusive education. So I have identified problem on field. There are only 3 teachers in district Chamba who teach in this disability, and there is in school there is lack of infrastructure and equipment regarding inclusive, including disability teaching, and और वहाँ पर ऐसा है सिचुएशन कि टीचर को अब तक मालूम नहीं है कि disability होती
We can't hear you, Goldie. Can you type it on chat?
All right, I'll type.
Yeah, now it's clear. Please complete.
Okay. कहाँ तक हुआ था? Sorry, कहाँ तक?
You said there are
Should
only
I start
few
from the
teachers.
beginning?
Disability, yeah.
Okay, yeah. पूरे जम्बा डिस्ट्रिक्ट में there are only 3 teachers. कोई इंस्टीट्यूट नहीं है, कोई प्रॉपर इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर नहीं है, स्कूल में कोई इक्विपमेंट नहीं है. So how to build the teachers capacity on this inclusive education? This is actually a question, and I'm working on this. And
it's not clear, Goldie. Could you please type your question on chat? We'll take it up. Thank you. Sri Lekha, you may please go ahead with your question.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'm from the kindergarten space. Earlier, I had typed a question in the chat. I'm not sure if it was answered, and I had to leave. The meeting was for some time interrupted for me. So this question comes from, I'm from the kindergarten space. So we have children who have little difficulty coming into this space and at various class levels like pre-KG, LKG, UKG. And we do call out, we do observe, and then if we find hello, yeah.
Yes, we lost you for a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So we do have children coming in with different needs. So is it okay to observe them at that level and give some feedback to the parent and ask them to take the child for OT in specific cases? Because some of the parents do not really readily accept it, and they want to come, speaking for their children, and they do not want to accept it. And then we do find some discrepancies. And then when they move to grade 1, we have a lot of issues that comes in. So when do you think is the right time to observe the child? Because some of them do believe that it is the developmental stage where maximum development happens. So eventually all of this will, iron out, and the child may not face issues when it comes to grade 1. So how much of it can we take as in this assumption that it'll all be okay? When do we actually raise the flag?
Can I answer this?
Yes, Aruna.
Yeah. Earlier is always better, Srilekha. So if you find there are children who are lagging behind on certain skills, or you feel there may be some developmental issues, I would suggest you are doing the right thing in terms of observing and recommending certain auxiliary services. However, I would caution from not labeling children. At any stage, I don't, endorse labeling, but especially in the younger classes. And so parents are also more likely to go with your recommendation if you don't put a label or necessarily make them feel that there may be something wrong with the child. But you can just say that there are certain skills that are behind, and the child may benefit from these services to catch up in certain areas. So I do think earlier is better.
Thank you. Just coming back to some of the questions on the chat. There's one question about whether B.Ed education is that if it incorporates inclusion, or should it? Is there somebody who would like to talk about that?
Kushal, do you want to go?
So my understanding of in pre-service is very limited, but what I have learned from largely from teachers is they have had a chapter on inclusive education or around disability, and of course that varies across the B.Ed and M.Ed curriculum a lot, but there is definitely no necessary practice or even understanding of the implementation on the ground and how that should look like. From the vocabulary point of view, they might have heard certain things, but never even dig deeper behind the existence of such things. So that's basically my awareness around the same. Can I add anything similar?
Yeah, even from my understanding, the current B.Ed courses, they talk about inclusion. Like you said, it's either a chapter or just like a very brief thing. What the NEP is now talking about is equipping all teachers with knowledge about specific learning disabilities, also knowledge about how to support students' mental health and socio-emotional learning. It is talking about in the space of teacher education, also various other things which have to do with training teachers in using various innovative things and creating what they call safe and healthy classrooms. And all of this with the aim of building an inclusive classroom in the process, because again, the understanding is now come that it's you can't do one thing and then say, okay, now I am being inclusive. What being inclusion means is create all of this, that you have a safe environment, you are able to address the social-emotional needs, mental health needs, or it's also, and of course, teaching and learning practices is at the core of it. So hoping as the policy comes into more of an implementation phase, it does take in, because that has been one of the biggest critiques of the B.Ed courses, that it doesn't equip teachers. And that is why a lot of the research says the teachers feel ill-equipped to address the needs, because they have never been taught, they don't know what they need to do. So a lot of it is building support structures within the school system to support mainstream teachers in providing that support, and within the pre-service education system as well, equipping general teachers with a lot of other knowledge to respond to student diversity, so that they are prepared, and building those perspectives of having a diverse classroom and what that diversity or what those different needs that children might have to. It might not always be in terms of what does it mean in terms of a disability, but more in terms of what are some of this child needs help with writing, this child needs help with reading, this child needs help with communicating. So what can I do as a teacher to help with these different needs, as opposed to what specific disability the child has and how do I actually then address that disability, but more in terms of what is the need of the child and how do I respond to the need in my regular classroom teaching and learning, because all my students will have. And hopefully such a B.Ed course comes to fruition across the country. That would be really, really, and that will probably attract what Aruna said, that teacher force, that attract talent that actually wants to and goes forward and takes all of this forward.
Okay, thank you. Uma, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, in inclusive education and special ed, are they contradictory, opposite? Or if the school is inclusive, having a special education department, how do I justify?
Hi, Uma. So a special education department, as we have all said, is there to support the mainstream classroom teachers, because sometimes the special educator has special training in how to respond to and has more in-depth knowledge about certain needs that students might have and how to respond to it. What we have ended up doing is creating a separate service provision for students with disabilities or other special educational needs, and them being sent to a special educator. If we actually have the special educator as a resource and support for the mainstream classroom teachers, as opposed to for directly only a few students, then we are not negating what an inclusive environment is, because they are just another resource for the mainstream classroom teacher to support the diversity that exists in the classroom, within the classroom. And there are certain support that, say, a special educator might provide extra support that might be needed. And that does not, again, negate, because it's one way of looking at it, negates it when we create separate service provisions within the same school, where we have mainstream classroom teachers, but we send certain students to only a special educator, and the classroom teacher only addresses the needs of a certain group of children. So within the inclusive education classroom, the role of a special educator is not redundant, but that is there of a very, very big support structure for the mainstream classroom teacher. If anybody wants to weigh in.
Yeah. Thanks, Seema. I think we only have a few minutes left. So if the panelists can kindly respond to some questions over chat, it will be useful, while we will let some of the participants who have raised their hands to ask their questions as well. I think Sanjida can go next.
Yes, good evening, everyone here. Ma'am, first of all, I would like to appreciate you all for giving such an intensive and a very detailed decisions of taking up the children into our stride and making the parents also much more beneficial for putting their children, for admitting their children in our school. Now, here I have a question where I need to know how to convince a parent that the child really needs a special help and the child is quite a challenging person for the teacher to handle. Of course, we do have special educators in our school who are focused on these children and who provide us a lot of things, how to deal with them in and out whenever we require their help. But how is it so very efficient on our part to deal with such children? Because the children also show a lot of disinterest, where they might feel they are weak in the class, or maybe they feel they are not at par with the class. So it truly becomes challenging for the teacher to take up the mixed classroom. So could you please emphasize on this question of mine. Thank you very much, ma'am.
Can I take that one?
Yeah, Kushal.
So yeah, Sanjita ji, I think thank you for putting up this such valid question on part of the school first. I think 2 to 3 things that need to be put as a thought process within the school first is, one, the space of the parent. Is the space of the parent or the understanding of the parent about the child same or similar to what the school is understanding? There are certain behavior the child might be exhibiting in the classroom, in the school. Are they similar to what is being exhibited at home? And is the parent also aware of certain things? Has that discussion largely taken place between the school and the parent? And that needs to happen from a sense of inquiry and curiosity rather than reporting to the parent about the behavior or issues being faced. Because more often than not, in my experience, like I've seen parents extremely unaware of what, for them, these things might be just normal behavior, but how do they actually play out in the classroom? What are the challenges faced by the child himself or herself are not being aware of the parent. So, and this brings to one critical aspect, which one of the speakers also highlighted before, is how do we take parents on board in multiple ways? And we think parents as partners here, rather than school addressing things by themselves, because that's definitely going to lead as a burnout stage from the school's part. So having that open dialogue around like what you are able to see the child struggling in, rather than child creating problem for the school, we understand what the child is struggling in, and is it something the same thing parent understand in the similar way? That could do a lot more, that could open a lot more dialogue of possibilities, rather than school taking the only responsibility of addressing the need as well. Seema and Aruna, if you want to highlight anything in that.
I think there are a lot of questions, so I think we'll just soldier on.
Kairali, would you want to ask your question?
Unable to unmute?
We can hear you. Okay, please type your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. My question is, can all children with special needs, can they be admitted in the mainstream school? Who decides what percentage disability should be there to be admitted? And so what happens to the children with severe disabilities? Do they continue in the special schools? Or children with mild intellectual impairment or cognitively impaired children, beyond class 4 and class 5, maybe they may not be able to continue in the mainstream school. Do they go back to the special school, or do they continue there with enough support for them? Will they be able to acquire some knowledge and skill training? It's been a doubt working on my mind.
Seema, you want to take that?
Yes. So there is the Right to Education Act says that any child get admission in any school and no school can deny admission. The Right to Education Act currently covers up till grade 8. So till the age of 14, a child can be in a mainstream school. And after that, unfortunately, sometimes schools might be asking them to move or at some point. But with the coming of the NEP, it extends the ambit of the Right to Education Act all the way up to higher education. So hopefully this challenge will not exist for students who want to continue being in the mainstream school if they are. Whether the decision to join depends on the family and the child themselves, what they also want. Like the child's opinion, the parents' family's opinion needs to count on what is the best form of education that they want to go for, whether it's the mainstream school, it's a special school, whether it's home-based education. And within the NEP, all of them have equal weightage. One is not looked at as better than the other or worse than the other. So keeping that in view, there is nothing which says that if you have this, then you can go to a special school, if this is the benchmark disability, or if this is the disability that you have. It recognizes the 21 RPWD defined disabilities, and the NEP says that if what the 21 disabilities that RPWD talks about, if it is there, then you can get admission in any school, and the school cannot deny admission. So that is what, and with the NEP, hopefully it also extends the ambit of the Right to Education Act all the way to beyond 14 years of age, as they have mentioned.
So I think because of the interest of time, we would, like to close the session. But to all the participants who have joined our session today, probably we could not take all the questions. So what I would request you to do, you may write to us. I'm sharing the email ID where you can just write your questions in case they are not answered today. We will definitely, send you a note from the faculty, whatever questions you have asked. And also, just to pitch in, there was one question regarding some, online courses that we are offering for practitioners. So yes, we do have our diploma programs that are meant for working professionals. So we have programs on diploma in inclusive education, diplomas in learning disability, and diplomas in early childhood education. So I'm just putting in the link to our diploma programs in the chat box in case if you are interested, you may go through it. And also our admission email ID. If you would request, any further questions to be answered by our speakers, we will be able to do that. So with this, I think we will like to end the session. Thank you all for joining us today. A wonderful session. Thank you to all the speakers with the learnings that we got from the session today. Yeah, with this, I think we can end the session.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and including the audience for those wonderful questions.
So also to the audience, just another ending note. We will share an email with all the links and even the YouTube live link of the session that we had, so that in case you would like to refer back or pass it to your friends, you can do that. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. I think with this, with this discussion, I think we can look at converting our wishful thinking into reality sometime soon. With that note, I think let's conclude. And from all of us here at Azim Premji University, we wish you a Merry Christmas and a very Happy New Year. Thank you all.